Good evening, everybody. It's good to have you here. Thank you for being here. My name is Nate Eaton. Today is the 2nd of May, day 20 of the Lori Vallow Daybell case. We have a lot to talk about tonight. It was an interesting day in court. Life insurance. How were Chad and Lori living after Tammy died? Neighbor visits. The Relief Society president from the LDS ward took the stand. She worked closely with Tammy. I'm going to play you some of what she said on the stand today. And a podcast. Yes, a podcast was introduced this afternoon. A podcast that the prosecution did not want played. In fact, there was several objections to this podcast that the defense wanted played. And ultimately, the defense won out. The whole podcast is an hour and 49 minutes. They played 40 minutes in court. I'm not going to play you the 40 minutes. We've uploaded it to our YouTube channel if you want to hear it. You may have heard some of it in the past, but I'm going to play you a little snippet of the podcast so you can kind of get an idea about what it was. So it was a fascinating day in court. A lot of information revealed. We're going to go through it all tonight. Let me know where you're watching from. I decided, I think about 10 minutes ago, that when this is all over, I might ask my daughter, Emmy, to go through the comments. That's a really bad idea, actually. I shouldn't have her do that. I might ask somebody, or I might do it myself and get a map and put a star on every state or continent or country of people who have watched this, just to kind of see where it's all gone. So don't be afraid to leave where you're from. Also, if you have any questions, I'll try to get to, of course, as many as I can tonight. It was a good day in court. Met some great people in court, and I have to say really quick to the gentleman from the Dalles, Oregon, who drove 6 hours and was sitting next to me. I apologize that we didn't get a photo together. He asked me to get a photo on the breaks, and we never connected. And then when I was leaving the courthouse this afternoon, I couldn't find you. So if you're back tomorrow, I'm happy to get a photo with you and tell your wife hi. I appreciate you watching. Okay, let's get right to it. Here's what we've got on the agenda tonight. Autopsy questions answered. The day began with Dr. Eric Christensen, the Utah medical examiner. He was back on the stand, and he kind of wrapped up his testimony with cross-examination from John Thomas, Lori's attorney. We also have life insurance, Tammy's life insurance, and what did her Fitbit show about her health? The police got a warrant. They were able to pull all of the data, and they presented it to the court and to the jury. Serving at church with Tammy, as I mentioned, the Relief Society president took the stand. I'll explain what the Relief Society president is. I'm sure some of you are like, what in the world is that? We're going to talk about the day Tammy died, how Chad interacted with this Relief Society president, and the stunning things that he told her and her husband in the days after Tammy's death. Visits with the neighbors and a remarriage. Chad and Lori weren't afraid to step out after they were married. In fact, they went and visited this neighbor, and then Chad even went back and asked for bond money to get Lori out. That was stricken from the record today after that issue came up, but we'll discuss it here. We have the podcast, and of course, we will remember JJ and Tylee and Charles and Tammy. Let me show you the sketches from today. There are the three witnesses. We have Detective Mattingly. He has been on the stand before. He works with the Fremont County Sheriff's Office. You can see the chart behind him on the right side of your screen. That's Tammy's Fitbit activity. And there was definitely no sign that Tammy was slowing down before her death. In fact, in the months right before her death, her steps actually increased. So we'll talk about that testimony. And then we had the Gilberts, the Gilbert couple, Alice and Todd. They lived about 6 houses down from Chad Daybell, and they both took the stand, of course, separately. We'll talk about their testimony. Here's an image of the bailiffs. So many of you have written in saying, are there guards there? You know, how is she secure? Well, you can see on this particular image, there's 3 bailiffs in plain clothes behind her, and then there's the one in the uniform, which is he stands near her, and then there are 2 others in uniform in the courtroom too. And then there's Ray Hermosillo, who sits on the front row of the gallery, the audience. So if she's going to try to run and make it past him, I'm sure he can jump into action. And then there's, of course, some other police officers in the building. So this is not an easy place to escape from. Not that I've tried, but just that I imagine that. And then we have this image of Lori listening while the podcast came out, was played today. She was thinking. She was very into it. Again, no real sign of emotion today. When she walked in, her hands were in her pockets, dressed in black and gray, I believe. And she sat down, and she is actively involved in her defense. She's not afraid to share her thoughts with her attorneys and whisper stuff and let them know what she's thinking. So those were the images from today. Just got the audio in, currently uploading that to YouTube. So when we're done, if you want to go listen to that, feel free. Let's kick it off with what Dr. Erickson said at the beginning. Dr. Christensen. First name is Eric Christensen. John Thomas asked, remember, he determined the cause of death for Tammy was asphyxiation. The difference between a medical examiner, which the state of Utah has, and the coroner, which the state of Idaho has, is the coroner doesn't require any training. The medical examiner requires extensive training. You become a forensic pathologist in a lot of cases. Tammy died in Idaho. The coroner went and examined her and basically said she died of natural causes. Her body was then transported to Utah, buried. When it was exhumed, the medical examiner in Utah did another autopsy and said, no, she died of asphyxiation, and pointed out the bruises that were on her arms. John Thomas asked, was she tested for poisons? Yes, she was. We found nothing in her system except an antidepressant that she had been on, which was at a normal level, and I believe tramadol, which was a minor level. Tramadol came up. John Thomas really harped on seizures. Is it possible that Tammy had a seizure issue? And he said there was no medical history of that. And it would be odd for a 49-year-old to suddenly have one seizure in her sleep and die. And John Thomas said, well, how can you prove it looking at the brain? Because if the brain, it's like he's compared it to a car. If the engine's running, you're going to be able to maybe see that there's a problem. But if once the engine's turned off, you won't be able to see if there's a problem. Could that be comparable to a body? That if you're having a seizure, you'll be able to see inside the brain. But once the seizure stops, the brain goes back to normal. You won't be able to see it. And the doctor did say, yeah, that is a point. That is a valid point. But a brain specialist actually examined Tammy's brain, cut into it. They found nothing abnormal in her brains, but the doctor did concede that anything is possible. Anything is possible. And that the bruises that were on Tammy's arms, he said, were likely caused because someone was holding her down. Again, he said, I can't be 100% sure. Nobody can because I wasn't there. But based on my experience of performing 7,200 autopsies and examining deaths for years, this is what I believe. So after his testimony, Bruce Mattingly, the detective with the Fremont County Sheriff's Office, took the stand. He talked about how he got a search warrant for Tammy's medical and pharmacy records. Now, we didn't actually see those. They were admitted into evidence, but we didn't see them on the screen. But by all accounts, on what Detective Mattingly said, Tammy was healthy. There were no issues. Again, she had the one medicine that I discussed earlier, and that was that. Then they decided to take her Fitbit, to get information from her Fitbit. Now, it was a basic model. One moment. It was a basic model of Fitbit. And so it was one of those that doesn't store the information. It tracks it. So it might track your heartbeat if you're working out. It tracks your steps, but it might not store all of that data. And they found out that the only thing that it stored on her Fitbit was her steps. And the steps were anything but slowing down. As Chad had said, she was feeling sick, she was becoming weak, she was having seizures, fainting, whatever. Not according to the Fitbit. And the detectives were hoping that she would have worn her Fitbit to sleep. She did not, to see, maybe help determine the cause of death if her watch stopped when she died. But she wasn't wearing it. And again, they showed a chart that showed her steps in the winter were lower than in the spring and summer, which is common given the weather in Idaho. But she was quite active right before she died, and she was averaging around 10,000 steps a day. Then we learned about the life insurance. We kind of knew this. This came out a while ago, but now it was admitted as a testimony in court to the jury. Here were the policies that Tammy and Chad had. There was a Primerica policy for $300,000 that Tammy and Chad took out when they lived in Springville, Utah years ago. They were each the beneficiary of each other's policy. So if Tammy died, Chad got the $300K. If he died, she got it. Then when she moved to the school district in Sugar City, she got a $130,000 life insurance policy from LifeMap. Actually, it was $80,000 in the beginning. And then when she went full-time or got a promotion, she was able to get $50,000 more. So the total amount of insurance that they had, life insurance, was $430,000. And the detective testified that that money was indeed paid out after Tammy died. When asked if the insurance company was aware of this and was conducting an investigation, he said yes. As far as he knew, there had been talk of that. He did not know the specifics. And when asked if Chad used that money while he was married to Lori, the detective said yes, that's how they were living. So I think most insurance companies, once somebody dies, you're paid out fairly quickly within 30 days. And so that money would have come in quick. And then Chad could have used that as he and Lori took his kids to California over Thanksgiving to Knott's Berry Farm. And then he and Lori took off to Hawaii. They had $430,000 that they were using to live, it appears, according to the detective. So that's kind of what Bruce Mattingly talked about her health, about the life insurance. Then we had Alice Gilbert take the stand. Now, Alice Gilbert moved to Salem in 2017 with her husband. They were familiar with Chad Daybell's books. They had read a few of them. They became friends with the Daybells, and Alice was asked to serve in a calling in the church. Now, at the LDS church, it's divided into wards, which are congregations, and several congregations make up what's called a stake, S-T-A-K-E. And each ward has a lady who is asked to lead the women's organization. And then there's also a man who's asked to lead the organization for the men, the priesthood. So the women's organization is called the Relief Society. These are volunteer positions, and Alice Gilbert was asked to be the president of the Relief Society. That means that on Sundays, they take care of the instruction. And when somebody dies, they help prepare for the funeral and help organize meals to be brought over. When someone needs help, they're basically the liaison for people who need help. Well, Alice asked Tammy to serve as one of her assistants. There's the president, and then the president has two counselors or assistants. And so they got to know each other really well. They met weekly during the week, and then they saw each other every Sunday. She said Tammy was kind of shy and kind of kept to herself, but she was a go-getter. She would get stuff done. She always said to keep things simple, and Alice said on the stand that that's kind of how Tammy lived her life. She kept things simple. It was 7 a.m. on October 19th of 2019 when Alice got a call from Emma, Chad's daughter, hysterical. Emma said that her mom had died. Alice was shocked. However, that February, so 6-7 months earlier, Chad had told Alice and her husband, Todd, who we'll talk about in a minute, that he had had a vision that Tammy would not live until she was 50. And that her time on earth was coming to a close. Now, the Gilberts really didn't think much of this. I mean, they thought it was a little odd because Chad was into that, but they didn't really push back like, what? What are you saying? It didn't sound like. They just kind of listened and said, oh, okay. And then this happened. And so Alice said that Chad took the phone from Emma, and Chad told her, don't tell the bishop. And she said, well, why? He said, just hold on. Don't tell the bishop for 30 minutes. And then they hung up. Well, Alice told the bishop that Tammy died. And then she went over with her husband to Chad's house. And I'm going to play her testimony of what happened when she got there. and kind of the behavior of Chad and the children who were there.
Did Chad respond when you asked if he'd already planned the funeral or if they'd talked about it?
Let me back up one moment. She got there, and she said Chad was acting very businesslike, and the kids were shocked and stunned. Chad said, "We're going to hold the funeral on Tuesday." And this was Saturday. And we're going to do it in Springville, down 5 hours away. And Alice was shocked and was like, "What? You're doing the funeral that quick?" And this is where it picks up. This is where the conversation picks up.
Did Chad respond when you asked if he'd already planned the funeral or if they'd talked about it?
He just said no, and that's all he said. But it did catch me off guard. It did surprise me.
Did you, in fact, end up attending the funeral?
Yes, I had to go see her in the casket. Sorry.
You're just fine.
I had to tell her goodbye. And she looked good.
And where was the funeral?
In Springville, Utah.
Did you ever ask Chad why the funeral was being held in Springville instead of where they resided?
You know, I didn't. I just assumed because they used to live there. I didn't. I was surprised because I would think that the kids would like to go visit her grave, and they, you know, if she was buried closer, they could go visit. But then they used to live in Springville, so I didn't ask him.
When you were at the funeral, do you recall making any observations of Chad?
He was standing by the casket. I told him that Tammy looked good. And he just said, "Yeah, she does." You know, it wasn't really mournful to me, but I didn't know how he was reacting to things, you know. So we went to the funeral. Was a really nice funeral. It was. And I was really amazed. The kids all spoke, and they did a good job. And I was surprised that they could pull it together so fast from the death, and then it would take a day to drive there and to talk. So I was amazed. They gave some really nice talks, tributes to her.
And do you recall if Chad also spoke at the funeral?
He did. He spoke last.
And did you make any observations regarding his talk?
He gave a good talk too. Maybe more like a church talk than a spouse would speak about their mother spouse.
And after getting back from the funeral, did you end up attending the memorial service?
No, we didn't go because we had just been to the funeral, and so our Relief Society presidency and the bishop fixed a meal, and we took it over to Chad's after the memorial.
And when you took it to Chad's house, was he there?
Yes, they'd just gotten back, and the kids were back, and so we put the food down, and the kids started to eat. And Chad said then that he was moving out. He couldn't be there. And we said, "Well, where are you moving?" And he said he's moving to Rexburg. He had a friend there that had a condo, and that his friend was hardly there, so he would let him stay there.
And the memorial was on Wednesday?
Yes.
And so by Wednesday, Chad was telling you he was going to move out of his residence?
Yes.
Were you left with an impression of if the friend was male or female?
He called him a he. Chad called him a he.
So you believed it to be a male friend that he would be
Yeah.
moving with? Did anything else strike you that morning as far as anything Chad told his kids?
Yes, he told them to go through Tammy's things that afternoon, which I was surprised. Yeah.
Okay, so Chad says he's moving out of the house with a friend who has a condo in Rexburg, an apartment. It's a he, and he tells the kids they need to clean out Tammy's stuff. Again, this is the Wednesday after she died, the day after her funeral. The interesting thing is that Chad kept in touch with the Gilberts. In fact, the Gilberts were trying to help him, and a few days after that, they called Chad and said, "Can we drop by a pizza at your new place and see how you're doing?" And Chad said, "No, you can't come here, but I'll come to your house." So he goes over. Alice had made cookies. He's eating the cookies, and he tells them that he's met his wife, his new wife. Here's that part of the testimony of Alice on the stand
So
today.
on Tuesday nights, we worked at the temple, and we were waiting in a room for a meeting to begin, and he tapped us on the shoulder and asked us to step in the hallway. And there we met her and her niece, Melanie, and another friend. And it was brief because we had to get back into the meeting, and so it was just brief, but it was a little awkward. It was awkward.
And then at some point, did Chad and Lori both end up coming to your house?
Yes, so in that week, so I honestly, I don't know if it was the next day or another day, but it was in that week. And they came to the house in the afternoon, and it was cold, and so I asked her if she was used to Idaho weather, and she said she'd bought some warmer clothes, and they came in and sat on the couch and was quite affectionate with each other.
And when you say quite affectionate, could you describe a little bit about what you were observing?
It was abnormal for us to see Chad that way. So, his arm was around her. He had his arm over her legs, and she was giggling and laughing. And for Todd and I, for my husband and I, we were embarrassed just because we hadn't seen Chad in a thing that way. Especially, they look like teenagers, and so. Anyway, so I asked her about her family, and she said that I asked her if she'd been married, and she said yes, that her husband died in December of a heart attack. And then Chad said, and she recently just lost a daughter. So I told her, "Oh, I'm sorry." And she said, "Thank you." And I said, "How many children do you have?" And she's kind of stammered, and like there were stepchildren involved, and so I did not get a definite number.
So, I'm sorry for not giving a little bit more context. After the visit to Chad's house, the Wednesday after Tammy died, the Gilberts, he says, "I'm moving out. I'm moving in with a friend." A few days after that, the Gilberts say, "Can we bring you a pizza?" He said, "No, but I'll come to your house." He shows up. Alice made cookies. He's eating the cookies. He says he's met a woman and that he thinks they're going to get married, but that they will get married when Christ tells him to get married. The Gilberts are stunned. They're thinking, what? Okay. They don't really know what to say. A few days later, that's where that soundbite picked up. They're at the temple in Rexburg. They volunteer at the temple. as they're there, Chad comes and kind of taps their shoulder and pulls them out of a meeting. And he says, I want you to meet Lori. And Lori's there with Melanie Pulowski, her niece, at the time, Boudreaux. So they meet Lori. And then the next day or a few days later, Lori and Chad go back to the Gilberts. And they're all over each other. They're like teenagers. By the way, when Alice said that in court, Lori smiled and laughed when she was described as teenagers. They're touchy, her hands, they just said it was awkward. And especially because Tammy hadn't been dead for a week or two. And they were close with Tammy, and they had never seen Chad act this way with Tammy. Chad says, I'm moving to Hawaii. I'm going to help someone write a book there, and I'm leaving. So they cut off, they leave, and the Gilberts are kind of like, oh, okay. Although they came back. Chad and Lori came back and went back to the Gilberts and to show them their wedding pictures. Now, remember, at this time, the Gilberts have no clue that Lori has kids. And they got married November 5th, so this is mid-November. We still don't know about JJ and Tylee. The police are just beginning to investigate what's happening here. We do know that Tammy's dead, not even for a month. And Chad's acting really quick. He told them repeatedly he told the Gilberts that Tammy visits the kids in spirit, and she's happy with this. She's glad that I've moved on, and they're accepting it. They like Lori, and blah, blah, blah. Well, then the story breaks, and the news comes out that Lori has kids, and they're missing, and their friend Chad is with her and is a person of interest. And then Lori gets arrested and is brought back to Rexburg. And Chad suddenly calls on his good friend, the Gilberts. And the Gilberts, he goes over and he asks them if they will put their property up for the bond so he can bond Lori out. Now, at this point, the defense objects that the bond issue is brought up, and the judge grants the objection. So the jury cannot consider that Chad went and asked them for bond money, at least at this point. If it comes up again, perhaps. I have heard on good authority that he contacted multiple other people to try to get that bond money paid. Remember, when Lori was arrested, bond was set in Hawaii at $5 million. It was then lowered to $1 million here in Idaho. So Chad was trying to come up with $1 million. He even went as far, so he goes and tells the Gilberts that I need bond money, and can you put up your property? And they said, well, we'll have to think about this. And the next day he calls and says that I've contacted a bondswoman. She's willing to come over and get this taken care of. And they're like, well, wait, we haven't decided. Hold up. We haven't decided this. And that's when Alice said she decided to ask Chad some questions of her own. And obviously at this point they knew about Tylee. And this is what Alice said.
Not getting into the context of why Chad was there or the other conversations, what, if anything, did he say regarding his prior statement that Lori had a daughter that had lost a daughter recently?
I asked him, I'm going to say this right. I did ask him how many daughters she did have. And I said to him, you told me when we met that she had just lost a daughter. And he said, no, I didn't. I said, yes, you did. And so I knew that it was Tylee that he was talking to me about. I asked him also, where are they? I asked him, where are the kids, Chad? And doesn't Tylee want a life, a job, a car, a boyfriend? And he said she didn't like people and she didn't like me.
And what struck you about those statements?
Because he said didn't.
He used the past tense?
He used the past tense.
Past tense. She didn't like people and she didn't like me. Then Alice said that she overheard Chad say to someone, "They think I killed my wife," which is interesting. Obviously, they did not give him the bond money. But here was a woman that knew Tammy well, that lived down the street, that had Lori and Chad visit her house, that was trying to be supportive of her friend. And then this happens. Now, on cross-examination, I believe it was Jim Archibald stood up and asked Alice about her beliefs. And Alice admitted that, yes, they did read some of Chad's books. And they went to 2 Preparing a People conferences, which is where Chad would sell his books and people would talk about the end of times. And Jim asked, "Was Chad weird?" And she said, "Yes, but I know a lot of weird people. There's a lot of weird people." And he said at one point, "Did you believe all this crap? Or were you just kind of curious about it?" And she said, "Well, I believe some of it, but not all of it." The key point was that she said Chad was enamored with Lori. They never saw him enamored with Tammy. And she said that to the jury. And that was the last thing she said when Lindsay Blake got up to ask her redirect questions. So it was a fascinating testimony from the neighbor. And it's on our YouTube if you want to listen to it all. And then after that, they call her husband, Todd. Now, Todd was closer to Chad than Alice was. Chad told Todd about his visions of death and the second coming. And they always understood that Chad's books were fiction with a hint of truth, with Chad's visions interwove throughout the books. And in fact, Chad liked the Gilberts so much that he actually included them in a book. It was the series of, I wish I would have written it down. I thought I did. Anyway, it was a series, The Times of Turmoil. And there's a Brother Gilbert in the book. And this was the Brother Gilbert. And he says it was flattering. He didn't seek it out, but Chad really thought highly of these people. So Todd also testified that in February of 2019, Chad came to him and said, "Tammy's going to die before she turns 50. And he said that on the morning Tammy died, when Todd went back to the house with his wife, Todd said to Chad at one point, "So it looks like your vision came true, or it happened." And he said Chad turned his back toward his kids and whispered to him something like, "Yes, it did." Meaning he didn't want the children to hear about this supposed vision that he had had. The day that Tammy died, Todd said Chad was very businesslike when he showed up at the house. He wasn't in mourning or distraught, it didn't appear. But the kids were. The kids were distraught. He said in 2019, things seemed to change with the Daybells. He said they used to always sit up front in the chapel, and gradually they started moving toward the back. And Jim Archibald later asked him about this and said, "Well, does where you sit in the church signify your spirituality?" And he said, "No, it just seemed that the Daybells were kind of drifting apart, or things were changing with them." He said he went to the funeral, and the funeral was odd because Chad spoke and gave more like a church talk rather than a talk about your spouse. He was surprised, first of all, that Chad even spoke, because a lot of times spouses don't speak at their spouse's funeral. And then when Lori showed up, she again, all the stuff about we're going to get married, stunning to this neighbor. Now, he had heard of Lori, believe it or not. Todd had listened to a podcast that Lori recorded with Melanie Gibb, Jason Mao, and a man named Thor. For the record, I have asked Thor and Mr. Mao, Jason, for interviews over the past few years. if you're watching, I'd love to talk to you, especially if you think that you're being mischaracterized. Reach out to me privately and we'll set something up. We can talk on or off the record. But they were brought into the case today. As far as I know, they are not on the witness list, but maybe they are now. So he had heard Lori's name before in this podcast that she recorded. And again, Chad repeatedly said that Tammy was fine with all of this and that Lori did not or had a daughter who died, but made it sound like it was an older daughter. So here's where we get to the podcast that I just mentioned. Excuse me, because Todd Gilbert mentioned that he had listened to a podcast with Lori and Melanie Gibb and Jason and Thor, the defense, when they stood up to cross-examine Jim Archibald, was able to say, well, we want to play the podcast, Your Honor. We want the jury to hear the podcast. Now, why would they do that? Why does it matter? And the prosecution was adamantly opposed to playing the podcast. And Jim said, all right, it's an hour 49. How about we just play the first 40 minutes? That's it. And Mr. Gilbert can testify if this is the actual podcast that he heard. He brought it up. The prosecution opened the door. Because they opened the door, we're going to play the podcast. By playing the podcast today, the defense was able to have Lori Vallow's voice, testimony, meaning her church testimony, be played for the jurors without any cross-examination. And that's what the prosecution argued against. They said it's self-serving testimony to have that part of the podcast played because they can't question her on why she said what she said, which I'll play in a minute, the fact she's seen Jesus and what her mission is. They can't question her because it was admitted through this podcast. So of course the defense wants to get it in there so that they can plant in the minds of these jurors where Lori's religious beliefs were back when this podcast was recorded in 2018. And that's why the prosecution doesn't want it. The prosecution argued that it was not relevant to the argument at hand, that it was hearsay because we were hearing from other people who were not in the court. The prosecution, I think, objected to this 4 or 5 times to the point that a sidebar conference was held. The judge went back in his chambers to review part of the podcast, but ultimately he let the podcast in under the conditions that, first of all, only the first 40 minutes were played. Mr. Gilbert had to identify the podcast at the beginning by listening to it and say, yes, this is the podcast I listened to. And then after we listened to the first 3 people talk, Melanie, Jason, and Thor, Lori spoke. But before Lori spoke, the judge went back in his chambers to listen to her portion. Again, the prosecution said this is really self-serving because she gets to, we can't question about this podcast. We could question Gilbert, but he doesn't know because he wasn't on the podcast. It's just something he heard. And the defense made the point, and the judge agreed that in the indictment, the prosecution lists the religion of Chad and Lori as being one of the reasons why these charges are happening, their religious beliefs. So some of you may have heard this entire podcast or bits and pieces of it. I'm not playing you the whole thing. Again, it's uploaded on our YouTube. You can go listen to it. It's interesting to hear if you're into it, but it had been heard by Todd Gilbert. And I do want to play you part of Lori's, what she said on this podcast and what the jurors heard. Now, the jurors have heard Lori on phone calls. The phone call to Melanie Gibb, the phone call to Colby Ryan, and the phone call with Summer Shiflett. That's about it. And she doesn't say much. This is the most the jurors have heard from Lori Vallow Daybell up to this point. And I want you to think in your mind, if you were there as a juror, what would you think after hearing this? About Lori's mental condition, about her situation, what would you think? And again, I do think that there was some strategy in having the defense wanting to play this podcast in. They wanted to get it in, and they had their chance today. So I'm going to play a few minutes of this.
Just be really quick so you guys can ask some questions. I am a witness of Jason now. I'm a witness to everything that he said. I can, but to what he says about what the prophet says and about what the Lord is telling us and about the warrior spirit inside of us. Right? My job, according to Jesus Christ, is to wake up the women warriors. Because I too have gone to the bottom edge, just like Thor. I'm a witness of his testimony, a witness of your testimony. I too have seen the resurrected Jesus Christ, and he has told me my mission, and he has sent me to help people and lift them in their missions. And so I testify about that warrior. That's what I feel like do. When Jason starts talking, I just start talking like this. I love to hear him speak. We go through. I'm just a normal person that grew up in the church, grew up in Southern California, went to Utah, went to BYU, did all those things, right? But my life turned bad. It turned really bad. And like Jason, I wanted to give up. And like Laura, I was ready to go to the other side. I'm like, this is way too hard. I didn't sign up for this. I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to be out of here. And I didn't want to kill myself. I wanted to pray and have the Lord just take me. Like, as a sweet mercy. Just take me. Done. I'm out of this game. And he showed me myself as a warrior in the pre-existence. As a warrior, like a beast. Like I fought with Satan. He hates me. I did all these things. And so he showed that to me so that I would quit whining. I was crying in the temple all day long in this lesson, bawling my eyes out. People coming up like, are you okay? No, I'm not okay. Just are crying the whole time. But he showed me so that I too could be the warrior that he sent me here to do. And do I want to go back and say, I can't do this, it was too hard, I didn't do it? No, none of us want to go back and do that. We came here to fight this war, and what I know directly from Jesus Christ, and angels from on high have come to minister to me. Okay? The time is now. That this war is on, and it has started. And what Jason gave us about a timeline is accurate, true, and correct. These things will start happening in the next 2 years, and things are going to change, and we need to be ready for that change. And how we do that? We sanctify ourselves. We turn our lives completely over to Christ, and we let him build the warrior from within. And I will say that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. You guys can ask questions.
I like them.
Yeah.
It's right. We ran into each other.
So can you tell us about the women that you are adhering to in power and whoever Jesus Christ sends to me. So I pray who he wants me to go to, and he sends people to me through various means. A lot of times at the temple. So that's the story of Jason and I. So I have some women that I know. That is obvious. Jason, I was sent to the temple on a certain day that there would be a message for me from Angel Moroni. On a certain day, go to the temple on this day. And I went to the temple on that day, and fully expecting the Lord to send me a messenger because that's what he told me. So I went to the temple, and we had done the initiatories, and I went to the celestial room, and I was with my friend who was also with me and aware that we were waiting for a message from the Angel Moroni. And Jason Mao walked into the celestial room, and I didn't know who he was. Although we had been in the same ward before a long time ago. He walks in, and my friend goes, "Oh, that's that guy who writes books about Moroni." And I was like, So my pink spirit is just like burning within me, right? Like, so my whole spirit is just like burning. I'm like, oh, we're going to have to go talk to them. Oh, I hate to go talk to people I don't know. And not like to just walk up to people and interrupt them in the celestial room while they're just pondering and those things. So I just wasn't going to do it. So I told the Lord, I said, if we're supposed to talk to him, then make him come talk to us. lunchroom, and we never sit on that side. And then we're sitting in this chair, and the Spirit told me, it's like, move to the couch. All right, I'll move to the couch. Like, I don't know why it makes a big difference. I'll move to the couch. Like, not that I'm not used to hearing these things already, and I don't know why I even thought it, right? So I just moved to the couch. And Jason had walked just right past us on the couch and sat right on the chairs next to us. So he got up to leave, and he didn't know why he had come to the temple that day, but someone had sent him to the temple that day. So I didn't let him tell that part, but he just got up, and we got up to shake his hand, and I'm like, hi, and you have a message for me from Moroni. So he was probably thinking, what is this crazy lady? And we started talking. And I got to hear his story and that kind of stuff. And then at the end of that, he's like, well, I need to get you with some like-minded people. I said, the Lord sent me, because I'm supposed to find these women that he sends me to, or sends them to me. And he said, he sent me to Melanie.
Good job.
And that is how Melanie and I met. And he sent her my information. She emailed me that day. She said, I'm doing a class on this Thursday. You should come. It's at the church up in Mesa. I'm like, oh, so far away. Okay, Heavenly Father, I've got to get a babysitter. I've got to do all these things to go meet Melanie. But I did. But then I saw her. I knew that she was one of them that I was supposed to be involved with and stuff. And she knew it when she saw me. And she gave her a little talk, and it was so cute. I loved it. And then someone else got to speak, and she walked out to the culture hall, and I was like, I'm going to follow her. And went out there and talked to her, and we were instant sisters because we knew each other before, and that's how the Lord works. So he sends me to people. He's building.
Okay, that's all I'll play for now. If you want to listen to the whole thing again, it's on our YouTube channel. But that gives you an idea of the podcast, and the jury got to hear a sample of that, the whole thing. Again, why would they play this? Well, that gave you a glimpse into what Lori was thinking and saying publicly back in, I believe this was 2018, end of 2018. So she had met Chad at this point. She knew who Chad was. And Gilbert said that he had actually heard one of the podcasts that Chad did with her. Or maybe he hadn't heard it, but he was aware of it. So they did a lot of podcasts. Remember the night that JJ died, Lori and Melanie were recording a podcast with David Warwick at his house. And I don't know if these were all part of the Preparing a People network of podcasts or if they had these individual branch offs that they were doing. But that's how that's how court ended today. I do want to explain kind of the procedural thing because they needed to discuss the issue of whether this podcast comes into evidence, but because they were discussing some issues that the jurors could be persuaded on, the judge had the jury leave the room. And then the defense argued why they thought, and the witness left the room. So then the defense said, this is why we want the podcast in. The prosecutor said, no, this is why we want it out. They kind of go back and forth. The judge says, okay, we're going to let it in. But the first thing we need to do is for Mr. Gilbert to authenticate it's the podcast he heard. So Gilbert comes in, he authenticates it. They bring the jurors in. We hear the first 30 or so minutes with Melanie Gibb, Jason Mao, Thor. I forget Thor's last name. After that, Lori starts to talk. And again, Lindsay Blake, objection, Your Honor. We believe this is beyond the scope or whatever she said. They call for a sidebar meeting. The judge then says, I need to go listen to this in chambers. We're going to take a break. Everyone goes on a break. Judge goes and listens to it. They come back. He lets the argument with the defense and prosecution again. Judge says, we're going to let the audio in. They bring in that jury. They play the audio. So that's how it all played out. In the end, will this hurt or help? I don't know. I don't know if it'll hurt or help the defense or the prosecution. I'm not sure. It does give us a glimpse into Lori's mind. This is the first real substantial piece of evidence that the defense has introduced. Granted, we're still on the prosecutor's chief in case. We're still case in chief. We're on their case. When the defense comes, they can introduce all their own evidence that they want. But right now, it's up to the prosecutor. And the defense has introduced a few things here and there. I can't even recall what they were. But this was the big one. Okay. That, I think, kind of takes care of today in 50 minutes. 6 hours and 50 minutes. But I do want to get to your questions. So I will be happy to answer these. Here we go. Oh my, there's a lot. Holy smokes. Okay. Would Lori and her attorneys already know about the DNA being found on tape because of discovery? Yes, they would have. They would have. They get a preview of all of the evidence, all of the witnesses. They know all that beforehand. As for the podcast today, it was not listed on their exhibit list. The exhibits are things that they want shown to the court, but it was listed on their discovery list, meaning all of the evidence. So there's all the discovery, which you submit, the prosecution had, the defense had. Then it didn't make it to the exhibit list, but because Mr. Gilbert mentioned the podcasts, the defense can then say, well, he mentioned it. We have the discovery. We want to admit it now that it's been mentioned. That's how they were able to get that in today. Nate, do you think you'll ever have a chance to interview Lori again? If so, what would be the very first question to her? Oh, wow, Karen. Probably, how are you? Might be the first one. I don't know. Yes, I hope she'll talk to me again. I hope that I'll have a chance to interview her again. And if she ever does agree to do an interview with me, I will have pages and pages of notes prepared to go. See, in interviews like that, here's a little behind the scenes in journalism. If someone agrees to sit down and talk to you and they're a controversial figure, or they've done something really bad, or they're accused of a crime, for me, it does not help to go in there and immediately say, why did you kill your kids? Why did that's going to shut the interview down. For me, my style is more, Lori, how have you been? How have the past few months been for you? What do you want the world to know? I'm more soft, I guess, and then you work your way into that. Because if you start the interview at hostile, it's not going to happen. So anyway, that's how I would take it. I know you all want me to ask questions of Lori, and I hope she'll talk. Have you heard if Chad and Lori are getting divorced? Are their attorneys advising them to? I have not heard that, Stephanie, and I don't know if their attorneys would advise them at that point. I think they have bigger things to worry about, but maybe that'll happen. Can you talk about Alex and his trip to Mexico? Maybe he went there to buy drugs to control the victims, Lisa asks. Yes, we do know he went to Mexico. I don't remember all of the details. He did pick up some drugs. I think it was, I don't even know. But if you go to our East Idaho News website and type in Alex Cox, Mexico, I'm sure the story will pop up, and that'll have all of the information there. I don't read through this is the first time I'm reading through your questions, so I can make it a little bit more spontaneous. So some of these I haven't prepared for, but I appreciate the question. Did Tammy keep a journal, Marjorie asks. If so, I hope it's brought into evidence. I believe she did. I know a lot of journals were seized from the home. I don't know if they were her specific journals. If she did, and if she wrote anything in there pertaining to this case, it has not been brought in as evidence. Nancy says, what is Lori doing with her notes? Is it true she gave her sister a note? So Lori takes lots of notes every day. I don't know what she does with them. I do know that she doodles and such on certain days. I had heard that she tried or did give a note to her sister when she was in court the other day. I don't know the extent of what happened with that. I personally did not witness that, but I have heard that she did. So maybe she's writing notes to people. I've seen her write a note and, scribble something and then hand it off to her attorney so that they see it. But I don't know what she does with those notes at the end of the day. Sandy, is there evidence that Chad was ever in bed with Tammy? He said maybe he twisted the sheets and that's how she fell out of the bed dead. I haven't heard if there was evidence in there that he was in there with her. So he said he was, but I don't know. I mean, we're going based off of his story and Garth's story. They were the only two people in the house that we know of besides Tammy. And that's all we know. So yeah, there's a chance he didn't even sleep in the bed. We do know that night Alex Cox didn't go to his house. He went to the Hilton Garden in Idaho Falls and spent the night. Rhonda, what does Lori do after court if she is in general population or a cell by herself? That will be up to I don't know if you mean now. Now she stays at the Ada County Jail, and I've been told she is by herself. She is a high risk. I shouldn't say high risk. She's a high publicity inmate In Madison, she was by herself in the pod. Occasionally, there would be other ladies that would come in. So when she goes to prison, I'm not sure how that works. If Lori is convicted and gets life in prison, the women's prison in Idaho is in Pocatello. She will be sent there, and she will live the rest of her life in that prison. And I have talked with women in that prison who have served time in jail, and they say it is a whole different place than the county jails. It is rougher. It is tougher. There is no sympathy. It can be a hard place to live, according to the women that I've spoken with. So I don't know. I don't know if she'll be in a cell by herself when she goes to the prison. I doubt it, but I'm not really sure. Nate, are you going to need counseling after this trial? Good question, Rosemary. I think that therapy is good for anybody who needs it. I have gone to therapy in the past. Several years ago, I covered a lot of really traumatic stories in a row, and I just kind of got in a funk. And I went and saw somebody a few times, and I was okay. So I think so. I think I might be. I don't think it would hurt to go see a counselor, and I would be open to doing that. I know this is no excuse. I always say, but I just don't have the time. I need to make the time, and I need to get into somebody good. So thank you for your concern about that. And I think that I say this for any of the court staff too, or other reporters that have covered it. It probably wouldn't hurt. Is Lori allowed to receive anxiety medication, something to make her docile? Spencer asks. I'm sure she can receive medication if she asks for it, or the doctor feels the need for it, like a Tylenol or something. I don't know how that all works. We have not been told much about her mental condition, if she's been given drugs for any sort of mental condition that she has. I will say that her behavior really hasn't changed in the 2 or 3 years I've covered her. 4 years now. Remember that day she walked into the Madison County Courthouse, that very first court appearance? She had her hair in mermaid curls and the bright lipstick from the Jolly Rancher, or the colored pencil in the jail. She kind of walked in the same way. She walked in this morning the same way she did then. She looks a lot different now. She's aged a bit, and her hair's a little different. I remember that day there was a Paul Mitchell school car parked in front of the Madison County Courthouse, and someone said, did she call up Paul Mitchell to come over and do her hair? No, she didn't. How many more witnesses are expected to testify? Jessica asks. I don't know, but the prosecution's been through 50 over 50 so far. So they're still racking them up, and there'll be more this week. Do you know if they have GPS data of Tylee's phone? Sharon asks. If they do, we haven't heard much about it, and same with Lori's phone, too. Why did John Pryor go over to Lori's attorney and talk with him and then left? Linda asks. Oh, I reported about this. I think it was either today or yesterday. He came in at the beginning. He talked with John Thomas and then left. I assume he wanted to know who was testifying today or who the witnesses were. He still has other cases to cover, so some days he'll be dressed up when he has other court. Some days he's dressed down in a polo and jeans. It just depends on the day. He was there for half of the day today, but not this afternoon. Missy, could Alex have had anything to do with his sister Stacy's death? I think he was there with her, and he used her credit cards after she died. Could they exhume her body next? I don't know if they'll exhume her body. I have not heard of an investigation into that death, and I have not heard if they believe Alex was connected to that. Do we know what time Garth Daybell got home from the Haunted Mill the night of Tammy's death? He was working at the Haunted Mill that night, which is a haunted house attraction that's outside. I don't recall if we know the specific time that he got home. I'm sure police have told him. He's told police that in interviews, or they have somewhat of an idea. Normally on the weekend, the Haunted Mill is probably open till midnight, maybe even 1. But I would imagine in the fall, midnight. So then he gets home maybe around 12:30. He could have gone home early, though, like at 11 or something. If Lori got life and Chad got the death penalty, would Lori be allowed to attend Chad's execution? No. In fact, the way that executions normally work is the victim's family, they're allowed to have representatives there if they wish. I covered the execution of the DC sniper, John Allen Muhammad, back in 2015, and there's a certain number of seats, and so the victims can have family members there if they wish to observe the actual execution. At that time, the media was able to have 3 representatives, somebody from TV, radio, and print, and all of the names were put in a lottery system and the names were drawn out. I did not get picked, but my good friend John Burkett did. He witnessed the execution. And then there's attorneys in there, religious clergy if they want. If Chad was sentenced to death, I imagine he might be able to have someone from his family, but I'm not sure how that all works in Idaho. Has anything been said about Lori's phone pings? No, Aaron, it hasn't, except that we do know that Alex had his on, his phone, GPS and everything, and from what we know, Lori did not, and neither did Chad. Is there a receipt for duct tape yet? Haven't seen one. Does Lori know ahead of time what's coming in court? Is she hearing the DNA results the same time we are? No, well, all the evidence that the prosecution has, the defense has. So if it's written evidence, then yes, they have it. They don't know what the witnesses are going to say. No one really knows. So if the witness comes out with some crazy bombshell, then, oh, wow, that could catch people off guard. Now, yesterday they had a chart of DNA, and they were able to say whose was who. So I think that the defense had a heads up of what was coming with the hair. Was David's DNA taken? He was taken. He stayed at Lori's. No, it wasn't. And I think, well, as far as I know, it wasn't. But maybe it was to test for JJ, maybe. Okay. I think we have one more. They discussed whether or not the graves could be dug in 17 minutes. Maybe the grave was dug ahead of time. After all, Alex went back and forth to Chad's for a couple of days before the presumed death date. That's a good point, Tracy. That could very well happen. Plus, you had 2 people there. So I think that's all the questions we have. I appreciate you all sticking with me tonight. If you want to get caught up through the day, here's where you can find me: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and our East Idaho News page. I just have to say that you guys are pretty sweet. All of you. Today I was sitting in court, and Rebecca, a very kind woman, comes up to me and sits down, and she saw my thing the other day about the candy that I like. So she made me this little goodie bag of hot tamales, Smarties, and she said for Emmy, my daughter, because I won't let them get a dog, there was earrings. And I don't know if you can see the earrings here. It's a bunch of like animals. There you go, like foxes and dogs and everything. And I know that many of you think I should let them get the dog, but we'll see. Anyway, we'll be back tomorrow. It's day 21. I don't know who's first on the stand. We do know that Melanie Pulowski is in town. We've seen her walk in and out of the courtroom yesterday, and I believe today. Did I see her today? I'm not sure. So she's in town with her husband, Ian. I imagine that testimony will likely happen tomorrow. So that should be an interesting testimony day. I'll be keeping you up to date throughout the day. And if you have any questions, again, I'll be happy to answer them. Thanks so much for watching Courtroom Insider. See you tomorrow night, 7:30 p.m. Mountain Time. I'll be back.